So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and I would say it's on the most up-to-date version of the test build, but that is not actually true. This is one of potentially two replays that I've had a little bit of an issue in trying to make work because an update for the test build was released in the interim between when I was away and when I was given these, so there's a little bit of confusion over where exactly certain folders are going, but I do have both versions of the game, so I should be able to make both work, though I have had some issues with the other one. I have at least managed to salvage this one, if all else fails. Anyway, this is another battle from Davo. I believe it's another battle map that he made as well, this one with a dwarven theme. The other one has got a dwarven theme as well, I believe, though that one is more of a civil war, whereas this one, I believe we're going to be seeing, yes indeed, the usual suspects massed at the gates here, and this would naturally be, I suppose, one of the Blue Mountains hideaways, considering it is Ered Luin who are already within the defensive shape, and it's going to be the men of Cardolan and the elves of Lindon who are rushing to the shelter of the dwarves, and they may have some issues right from the off here, as there are already some rather nasty looking goblins and orcs looking to hunt them down. But a rather interesting looking map from the outset here. Again, it's one of these where the terrain is going to be doing a lot of the defensive work for the defenders, although I think because of the more constricting nature of it and the shelter that all the cliffs offer, it's probably going to be a little bit easier for them to defend here than it was in the last battle replay that we saw, where the cityscape was a little bit more open, whereas this one a little bit more of a mountain pass type feel to it, as many dwarven maps tend to have. In spite of the fact there are dwarven buildings littered around the place, it is mostly the mountains themselves that are going to be doing the heavy lifting in terms of the defence. Anyway, let's go through the attackers first and foremost, as we usually do. TS Niehoff over here playing as a Misty Mountains force, the classic enemy of the dwarves, of course. And the White Turret Fearmongers, we're starting off with a unit which, from their perspective at the very least, is something which can go toe-to-toe with many of even the scarier units of dwarves, because of the phalanx formation offsetting a little bit of the quality gap that equivalent units will have from the dwarves, but also the armour piercing, which is very necessary for punching through that armour. Cardolan as well do have a certain reliance on their armour, especially with their rank and file units. If they want to be efficient, they need their armour to be doing some of the work, though Lindon, of course, as far as any faction in the game goes, the least reliant on that, so armour piercing not the be-all and end-all here, but for the vast majority of factions they're facing today, the Misty Mountains will be glad for it. Uruk Host as well, more of a numerous unit than they were in the last version of the game, where they were kind of intended as not too dissimilar from something like the Uruk High Infantry. I think the gap between the two has been made a little bit more pronounced now. The Uruk Host will be similar in terms of the level of quality to what you might expect from a standard unit from the Kingdoms of Men, and similar in terms of price as well. They do have, I think, a little bit more in terms of numbers, but individually they might be a little bit worse, but very much an equivalent kind of unit here. Obviously shielded, armoured, better certainly than the goblins that the rest of the Misty Mountains force will inevitably be made up of, though I think having a look at this, TS has gone for a slightly more quality-centric build with the Misty Mountains, as far as you can do with them anyway, and considering it is a 4v4, you do want to have the quality advantage if you are the attackers. Heavy Goblin crossbows, we've mentioned in the past, of course, and saw in the very last battle replay as well, that crossbows like this can be extremely effective if you can get them into a good position, and even getting a few good volleys off can be enough to really tip the balance of power in the attacker's favour. Again, I think because of how sheltered this map is, it'll be more difficult for the crossbows to be used effectively this time around, but we shall see. They're still one of the more deadly tools that the Misty Mountains have at their disposal in this kind of situation. Goblin Kingsguard, a very basic unit as far as a bodyguard tier unit goes, in the sense that they're sword and shield, not too damaging in terms of what their attack abilities are, but decently survivable for the kind of unit, and more numerous than many other kinds of bodyguard units as well, though that has been made a little bit more commonplace now. A few more of the bodyguard units of this type have been given a few more units, so maybe the edge the Goblin Kingsguard had in that regard is no longer quite as pronounced. We also have the Blackback Mountain Berserkers, the more aggressive units of bodyguard infantry that the Misty Mountains have, of course, and this will do them wonders again against the likes of Cardolan and the Dwarves, where you want to be having those more savage armour-piercing attacks that they're known for. Drake Broodlings, I don't know how useful they're going to be in a constricting map like this. They can be used effectively, they can be used as that living battering ram, as we saw in the last battle replay as well, where the Misty Mountains played their part. But if the defenders are doing their due diligence, they should be more easily bottled up in a dwarven type settlement like this. Snow Trolls as well were pretty damn effective last time out. They were used at the right time then. Can they be used in the right way now? I'll have to wait and see. Again, they're a little bit stronger in terms of prolonged combat than the alternatives the Misty Mountains have, and they're very quick as well. That's a distinction that they have not lost since the last version of the game. Snaga skirmishers were surprisingly effective last time around as well. We all know that cheap javelins, especially in orcish control, can be very, very good because they're so numerous. You can't leave them to their own devices, but even if they're just being used as a pincushion for enemy archers, that's not really the kind of target that enemy archers want to be going after because of their cheap cost anyway. So it is a conundrum, it always is, but the Snaga skirmishers, again, armour piercing as well, so it does all add up. Black Uruks of the Mountains, 3 units of them, probably the unit of infantry that the Misty Mountains have that they can mass like this with the highest finesse. You could even say, even among the bodyguard units, the Black Uruks have got more finesse because they're a little bit less savage than the Black Uruks than the Blackback Mountain Berserkers, I should say. But yeah, this will be one of the better combatants that the Misty Mountains have for trying to combat the Elves on this occasion. Again, not 1-to-1, but the Misty Mountains never take their fights 1-to-1 anyway. A couple of units of the Moria Spear Guard, ever the efficient, pretty cheap, pretty effective spear that the Misty Mountains have. They can be here. Cave Troll Drummers, now with their morale boosting effects actually working, they become a very important unit for the Misty Mountains because it can keep their large but potentially mentally fragile armies pointing in the right direction. Not that that was ever an issue for the Mountain Orc Berserkers. Locked morale, but very low survivability stats, but still armour piercing while they remain up. And then the Crawlers, the fodder class unit that the Misty Mountains have. Sort of these malformed goblins in a loose formation as well. They real mob as they move forward. But they add a little something, certainly thematically, to the Misty Mountains, I think, in comparison to what the Goblin Infantry used to. Now we move on to the Warlord, playing as Angmar. Angmar, of course, certainly more tanky than the Misty Mountains on an individual basis. Certainly the Witchround Blackguard are a little bit less numerous than the Goblin Kingsguard, but individually noticeably stronger. The Trolls of Angmar, weirdly enough, it's not really down to stats. It's been down, I think, more to circumstance than anything else, but it's actually been the Angmarim Trolls that have been the most effective in these new patch previews that we've seen. And again, the Olag High and Trolls of the White Hand are individually stronger, but I think, again, it's circumstance which has led to these guys actually being the most effective of what we've seen anyway. Blackwatch Legion, mass pushing in a more constricting environment against the Dwarves, who are perhaps better placed to deal with that sort of thing. It won't be as much of a surefire thing for Angmar this time around, but if they can get the timing right, it can still be extremely effective. Guardians of Cardolan without the armour upgrade, but they don't necessarily need it with their shields anyway. Not the most damaging class unit in its class, but again, it's all about that survivability, that death by 1,000 cuts that Angmar tends to inflict on their enemies as they rely on their armour to keep them alive. Witchround Pikemen do have the armour upgrade though, so that will make them a little bit more resilient to enemy arrow fire coming their way. And phalanx units like this obviously also have a very important role to play, especially late on potentially against the quality that the Dwarves and Elves can bring to bear. A couple of units of Gundabad Guards, similar to the Guardians of Cardolan, only even more so. They're not going to be able to deal as much damage because of that spear malice, but they form relatively similar roles. They can at least be good against cavalry as well. Plenty of Angmar halberds, interestingly enough, as well as some Angmar marauders, so they're going for some numbers too, which is wise because there's no way to avoid taking a lot of damage on a map like this, so you may as well take that damage with units along these sorts of lines. Then we have the Witchround Hammer Guard as well, obviously armour piercing, high-end units. Those rusted warhammers will be hoping to cave in some Dwarven armour throughout this battle, I'm sure. Y2K86 playing as the Kingdom of Rhudaur, so the Northmen marching in step with their overlords once again. Witchrealm Enslavers very similar to the Hammer Guard we just mentioned, wielding those armour-piercing tridents of theirs. We have plenty of units of Rhudaur clansmen as well. Rhudaur's rank and file is numerous, a little bit more damaging than you may expect, but also deficient in all the ways you would expect as well. Their armour and their crafts, not exactly their strong suit. But the Etamor's Troll Hunters here do pack on a bit more armour, and of course throwing projectiles, something that Rhudaur do very, very well. Positioning is going to be a little bit more difficult on a map like this, as we've already mentioned with the crossbows and with all of the other supporting units that the attackers may be wanting to use here, but Rhudaur are better than most at making use of all of these units anyway, and indeed to be their most effective they need to. Granadine Pikemen, kind of similar to the Witchround Pikemen, they don't have access to the same level of armour, especially not when the Angmarim ones have got their armour upgraded, but they do have a shield to partially make up for that, so it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, really. Paradigm Berserkers with more throwing projectile power and obviously pretty damn strong in melee as well, maybe not quite so much as the Enslavers, but still. And then we have the Coldfell Maidens who, as I've said before, Javelin Cavalry like this, you can use them as a means of preventing the enemy from sallying out, because they are an anti-cavalry cavalry unit at their heart, maybe slightly fragile, but they still do that job. But if all else fails, you can still use them as regular javelins, and the mass of cavalry like this can also be its own boon late on, but we rarely see anyone outside the AI in campaigns use cavalry in quite such a gung-ho fashion. And finally, for the attackers, we have Hidden, playing as another Angmar in force, again in a giant blob. We can see the barrow wights on this occasion there. I'd be very surprised if the other Angmar army didn't have that as well, because they're ideally placed in this kind of battle to try and absorb the pressure that the settlement itself can put you under. Plenty of halberds, we've got more trolls, which stick out a little bit more obviously, of course. Gundabad Guard are in there, and I imagine it's mostly the same sort of thing. Angmar, their roster isn't as small as some others, but you always kind of know what you're going to get with them. Whether they go slightly more numbers-centric or more quality-centric, it's really a sliding scale. Other than that, though, because of their very low amount of ranged options, you know what they're going to be doing for the most part. Now then, the forces that are going to be trying to hot-foot it over to the settlement as quickly as they are able. We have the Womb Raider playing as the shores of Lindon. Lindon, of course, in the previous version of the game were very underwhelming indeed as a faction, but with the overall mechanical changes, they are going to be ones to benefit. To what extent, I don't know, but on this kind of map where, especially against these kind of forces where the range support is not going to be quite so easily able to take advantage of their lower armor score, they should make for a really decent foil to the slightly more, well, far more armor focused dwarves and obviously the human elements of Cardolan. I think Lindon really add some good strengths to both. Harlingen infantry, for example, obviously you'll see the difference in focuses between the factions as we go through the other defenders, but obviously the Harlingen infantry very much about that finesse in melee. They can do more damage than the equivalent units that they're going to be fighting alongside today as well, but they may be a little bit less able to withstand that fight in the meat grinder as a result of those lower armor scores, but the melee defense is very good. Mythalon Swordmasters, I mean, this isn't unique to Lindon by any means among the elves, but the elves are very good with their heavy swordsmen, and that should put them in very good stead against low to mid tier, even into the upper tier of orcish forces. The armor piercing may be nice against most orcs, but it's not necessary really when you consider the level of quality that the elves are rolling with anyway. Mythalon Pikemen as well, obviously phalanxes for the defenders, very, very important because it means that the attackers won't just be able to bowl through you with reckless abandon. We've got the Lindar Bowmen, one of the new units for Lindon. They're relatively simplistic in what they are, a light unit of archers that come equipped with a spear as well, so multifaceted perhaps, but I feel like this is the kind of hybrid unit which is maybe a little bit more useful on a field battle in this kind of situation. Their utility is a little bit more limited, but we'll see how they go. Mythalon Marines, good unit of javelins combined with being good makeshift line infantry as well, and that sort of hybrid unit is the sort of thing which is very useful in a siege battle like this. We have the Wardens of Elos Tyrian, of course. Rangers now very different from what they once were, but the huge base damage on them now, especially the elven ones, should put them in good stead for hunting down bodyguard units even still. Noldorin Guard, obviously, this is where Lindon do depart from their norm, and the Noldorin units among them do have access to some of the very finest armour in the game, and the Noldorin Guard and the Noldorin Blade Masters with their second hit point as well. Very, very scary as a duo. Now moving on to the human units, who have got a shorter journey, certainly, to get within the safety of the dwarven walls and cliffs. We have Medexa playing as Cardolan once again, the duo back in effect. We have the unupgraded Tharbad Warhammers, which is a bit of a shame. I really do like the new upgrade on the Tharbads, but the armour piercing on them will be, of course, very useful for all the reasons we just mentioned. They lack a little bit of the finesse of the elves, but sometimes you don't need finesse, sometimes you just need to clobber the enemy as hard as you can. We've got the Gatekeepers, we've got the... actually no, we don't only have the Gatekeepers, and Cardolan Sharpshooters, which we'll get onto in a moment, but crossbows, of course, are the ranged unit of choice for Cardolan, and unlike the attackers, who will have an issue in positioning their ranged units to be used just so, that will not be an issue for the defenders, and indeed where they position them and how they use their ammunition may be the difference between victory and defeat for both sides here. We'll see Hearthguard of Amon Sul and Cardolan Archers, the bodyguard unit and the regular unit of more heavily armoured trading archers, you would call them really, but considering it is the Misty Mountains and Angmar here, Rhudaur may have the odd unit of hidden archers or two, but for the most part, they are going to be free to use their arrows as they see fit, which is going to make a big difference, I think, for the defenders. Tharbad Tollkeepers, relatively simplistic spears, good defensive stats on them, pretty woeful offensive stats though, but that sort of hyper specialisation even at this sort of entry level of unit can be very, very useful because it means you know exactly what you can get from them, and if you support them right on the front line they will do a decent enough job for you. More Cardolan archers, plenty of these Tharbad Tollkeepers as well. Here are the Cardolan sharpshooters. They are of course mace men in melee though. Their abilities in melee are still fairly limited. The armour piercing is nice, but don't expect them to punch up too far. They are still ultimately a crossbow first and foremost. The shield is nice though. Mercenary crossbows as well, so really doubling down on these crossbows. A little bit more mobility as well, but fragile, very fragile. And some Greenway footmen as well, so cheap pikes. Even very basic pikes can be very useful for defenders and attackers alike in a siege as long as you utilise them correctly. And then the first of the two armies fighting on home turf today, we have Tommy playing as one of the Ered Luin armies. We have some marksmen of Thorin's Halls. Obviously, Ered Luin among the dwarven factions at long range are probably the best now, given the fact they have the most options. They obviously lack the close range punch of Erebor, but yeah, at long range they can still be incredibly devastating. Warriors of the Blue Mountains, obviously regular dwarven infantry, the stone hewers as well. This is where the dwarves will really earn their salt in this kind of battle, because their slightly bulkier armour is going to allow them to do really well in these choke point environments, and obviously just the general higher stats of the dwarves in comparison, certainly to the orcs, is going to be very nice. We have the unlocalized placement text, which I'm still not sure what they're supposed to be called honestly, but they are a bodyguard tier unit. We have got the Frost Spears of Azagal. This is a very unique kind of unit. They're not really a Greek fire unit, they're kind of a hand gunner almost, but not as slow firing and not as devastating. It's more like a repeater really, where you do constant low to moderate damage on the enemy, and as long as you have a clear line of sight on them, that will add up very, very quickly. Again, they've been damaging in the past, but they've not been match winners in any game we've seen Ered Luin be a part of, on this channel anyway, so far, and plenty of other Guardians. I mean, Thorin's Halls units are the higher end version, and then the Blue Mountains units are the more basic version. It's the same structure as the other dwarven forces. Meanwhile, again, Warriors of the Blue Mountains once more, a couple of units of them, the Defenders of the Blue Mountains, the Spear variants, the Stone Hewers, the Shock Infantry variant, Marksman of Thorin's Halls, as we already mentioned, obviously a more heavily armoured archer, good for skirmishing, but like we already mentioned with Cardolan, they're not really going to be having to trade back and forth with too many enemy archers. They will be free to use their arrows as they see fit, which is good for them, but also it may be a situation where they may be wishing they had a more aggressive archer, but maybe that's what Lindon can fill. Frost Spears, we have more Guardians of the Blue Mountains as well, obviously another Javelin type unit, more evidence of Ered Luin's slightly more ranged focus. Guardians of the Blue Mountains, we have the Wardens of Thorin's Halls, obviously a dual-wielding axe unit, very nice. Defenders, Warriors, and more Warriors, and if we've missed anything else, there's some more Marksmen back there. But yes, I will be making a little cut here. I don't know how long that cut is going to be, because it could be that Angmar moved to try and cut Lindon off. That would be interesting, but I have a feeling there is going to be a grace period enough to allow Lindon to at the very least get beyond Angmar, and then maybe we'll get going relatively quickly. But yes, I will rejoin when the first blows are being struck. So I think we will rejoin here, just because the minimap is suggesting that this could get underway at any moment, even though the actual damage has not yet started. So Angmar, and well, actually it is only Angmar for the time being, that are stacking up over here, and it's going to be the Misty Mountains cycling over to the other side to go with Rhudaur, which I find a little bit confusing. I mean, Angmar perhaps will be hoping that their more heavyweight nature can try and prize the more mentally fragile Cardolan and the more physically lightweight Lindon apart more easily perhaps than the dwarves in this more constricting part of the settlement, but I would have argued that Angmar would have also been better placed to maybe put up more of a fight in those narrow choke points because of their higher defensive abilities. Rhudaur's armour piercing may allow them to do more damage against dwarven foes such as this, but their own survivability in this kind of environment, if left to their own devices, is maybe a little bit lacking. It is interesting as well, once again, just like Davo's last map that we saw, this being the second of his creations that we have been able to showcase so far, it does appear like the layering of the settlement in terms of the elevation of the terrain does vary quite a lot throughout the settlement. It's not just a simple slope from the outer edge to the inner portion. It does look like there's, once again, quite a lot of varying levels to be utilised, and that does make things look a little bit more complicated from the outset. But if the defenders are doing their due diligence, they should be able to take advantage of this sort of shape, perhaps more so than they otherwise would. Crossbows, of course, in very good positions as well. The sort of thing which the attackers will want to try and get rid of if they can, but as we already mentioned, they don't really have the most in the way of projectiles of their own, and certainly not Angmar. Angmar, of course, very well known for being, at long range, certainly the weakest faction the game has to offer. The Witchers do offer them something a little bit special in that regard, but it's more of a short range, almost more comparable to javelins, really. Throwing projectiles of a different sort. There are some areas of the settlement that are a little bit more open, like this bit down here, for example, right at the front, where if the Misty Mountains do flood forward, very akin to the last siege we saw actually, they could try and overwhelm this section, but I think Tommy does have all he needs here really to be able to put on a very good defence, and the Snow Trolls, Dwarves in general, are going to be one of those factions which are going to be a little bit more well suited for dealing with trolls. I mean, Rhudaur have absolutely no opposition over here. I think we will need to speed things up actually. I clearly misjudged how close to the fighting we were, but Rhudaur have a clean shot at going through this part of the fortress, but then it just means they're going to have to wait for longer before they can actually be of use to their allies. And a little bit further back again, this first part of the defence over here perhaps is a little bit more open, and a little bit more ground has been ceded to the attackers right from the outset. Velosterium popping into view very momentarily there. Oh my god, there's that little... I mean, this is an interesting thing to try and do as well, with Lindon bringing this small section to bear, but it makes the attacking shape a little bit more difficult for the attackers. They have to deal with that clutch of resistance, and with stuff like the Noldorin Guard in there, it's not the sort of thing they can just send any old garbage up against. But it also means that that's going to take the sting out of the attack, which is actually penetrating deeper into the settlement. As we continue to wait. Seemingly a bit of a feature of these last two siege battles, which is always a little bit unfortunate. Again, at this stage in proceedings, there really isn't any need for waiting around. I'm still confused as to why the Misty Mountains were the ones that moved over to here. Very, very confusing. I don't think you gain or lose a great deal in doing such things. Guardians of the Blue Mountains ready to throw their own projectiles in. Black Orcs of the Mountains, as I mentioned, probably one of the better units the attackers have for combat against the elves. But they will instead be going up against the dwarves. Did the mercenary crossbows just fire any volleys in? It doesn't... Oh no, they did. A couple of dead Gundabad guards here. So we will go down to 1 speed now. Barrow Whites will be on the front line as well, to no one's surprise. I mean, it is over here, the two attackers over here, far more easily able to coordinate their efforts down those two lanes, and being Angmar as well, they won't be going anywhere anytime soon, so I do think that's where the attackers will probably be at their strongest, or their most dangerous anyway. Etenmore's Troll Hunters now also throwing their own payloads in, javelins scything through some of these defenders of the Blue Mountains. Basic spears though they may be, they are still dwarven infantrymen. And as is often the case, the attackers can afford to go after lowlier troops as long as it gives them even more of a numbers advantage later on. Numbers advantage is certainly what they will have. Orcish factions facing off against dwarves and elves. that much was never really in doubt. What is Davo going to do here then? I mean, the Etamor's Troll Hunters are probably worth going after with some sort of projectile unit as well, because not only are they javelins that carry a fair amount of punch, but also defensively in melee, as slightly more heavily armoured spears, they do fill a fairly important role for Rhudaur there as well, but also that self-same armour and shields makes them a little bit more resilient to any sort of ranged presence you would try and utilise on them. Again, this is maybe an example of not really using the shape of your own settlement to good effect here. Just sort of standing there and taking that damage on the chin when you could just wheel yourself around the corner and force the Etamor's Troll Hunters to come forward. Play that game of cat and mouse and try and catch the Etamor's Troll Hunters out by quickly moving in and doing the business. Valostirian revealed, so you can only hide when units are not nearby, and that's certainly not going to be the case from where they're stood there. Cardolan sharpshooters, meanwhile, like shooting fish in a barrel, as they say, because easy shots, Angmar Marauders, Gundabad Guard, Barrow Wights, and Angmar Halberds here, all in a big lump. That was blank firing, but softening the initial Angmarim force up, and basic units like this, not really worth using too much ammunition on. The Frost Spears, though, one thing that I don't really know is how much ammunition the Frost Spears have at their disposal. I mean, like I said, kind of a repeater unit. Not a huge amount of damage per projectile, but very consistent damage often, especially when you have a clean shot like this. I don't necessarily think their base damage makes them ideally placed for dealing with Barrow Wights, but they could rip through the Angmar Halberds like any ranged unit could. Lindar Bowmen as well, basic though they may be, by Elven standards, that's still going to be more than enough to deal with the rank and file of Angmar. Moving forward as they are. Interesting that there are Lindar Bowmen over here. I don't really think they're going to be in the best of, or having the best of angles. It is going to be an awkward shape to deal with, however. If they misjudge it, the attackers, the defenders could turn things on their head and counter-attack into them, which would always be interesting. Meanwhile, defenders of the Blue Mountains, having taken that initial damage, softened up, now having to withstand an assault from the Ered coast. And the Ered coast, through sheer numbers, will be able to win this fight now. More on the way forward. Snaga skirmishers revealing themselves. What are they going to try and fire their javelins at? Warriors of the Blue Mountains joining the front line. That will turn that fight back around into the dwarves' favour. And so, very densely packed up against the Ered coastline, so the Snaga skirmisher javelins not quite able to get the best of shots into them. Into the Blue Mountains. Still biding their time and waiting, as are the Misty Mountains. And then further through the settlement there is the small matter of this other route, Coalfell Maidens, perhaps Davo losing focus on this area over here due to the attack happening down the other lane. I mean, the Coalfell Maidens charging in, but the defenders of the Blue Mountains won't mind that too much. It'll be the javelins that they'll be a little bit more concerned about. Those charges could still result in a rout, even against the dwarves, but Rhudaur clansmen and cavalry. Again, it's going to be a matter of numbers here. The defenders of the Blue Mountains showcasing their resilience in a losing fight once more, but they are going to need a little bit of extra support if they are to come out on top here. Davo clearly has realised what's going on now, but more than one unit of spears is going to be needed to stem the tide here. Ranadine Rangers, more Rhudaur clansmen. Rhudaur in general slowly filtering their units in, but that could build into fever pitch more quickly than not. Meanwhile over here, this is going to be, I think, probably the most striking initial fight. The Barrow Wights facing off against this initial Lindon defensive position, but the Barrow Wights without any sort of backup are not really going to do damage that quickly to the elves. Angmar Halberds getting hit, meanwhile Angmar trying to force their way more directly through the settlement perhaps. Hidden sending his trolls along with some of his more basic units in here. The elves and the dwarves fighting as one unit. 2 units of Horns of Elos Tyrion as well, so that's a lot of high damage that's going to be being sent down range. The Stone Hewers now moving into melee. Their presence will be sorely needed to help deal with those Trolls of Angmar, which, as we've said, in the past battles we've seen them in the test build, they've always seemed to be extremely effective. I know the Trolls are a matter of some debate. I personally think they're fine, but not really gaining the attackers any sort of extreme momentum here, but the Blackwatch Legion could help change that. The defenders need to be on the ball here and ready to potentially meet this challenge, and I'm worried that they're not. They don't have other infantry units ready to reinforce the lines, and those Blackwatch Legion are easily going to be able to crunch their way through or past the line, which is only guarded really by a very thin section of Harland and infantry. So you could probably have achieved the same sort of results with a unit of regular spears as well, but the Blackwatch Legion will certainly be able to do the business here. And right about now is probably when the defenders are going to start to panic, because that is definitely not what you want to be seeing from their perspective. And this is probably where, oof, dear oh dear. There goes the Witchers are getting shot by something. Fair play for them for noticing where the Witchers are, because I've completely lost track of them. The general is gone, but this is perhaps, like I was about to say, where this tactic of having this little section of Lindon forces over here is probably going to come back to bite them, because it means that those were units that would have been on this regular front line if they had gone for a more orthodox defence. Blackwatch Legion getting hit by the Mythlon Marines, but they have bulldozed their way through an underprepared front line, and that's exactly what Great Shield Infantry is so dangerous at doing. And now this is also coming in conjunction with an attack from the Misty Mountains, so this means Tommy can't really cycle too many of his units away from this area, otherwise the Misty Mountains will simply bowl over what remains with their numbers. Again, shape of the defence was always going to be extremely important here. Where they choose to put their skirmishers, I think, is actually fairly decent from a defending perspective, but where they've chosen to put their infantry, I'm really not so sure about. And if they do go on to lose this fight in the long run, if the attackers are successful in this one, that will be one of the main things I'll be pointing to come the endgame splash screen. We're still very early on though. This battle, once it has got going very, very quickly. But once again, we're seeing the attackers make full use of these high mass units which are designed to shatter organised lines very quickly. Drake Broodlings, Blackwatch Legion, the Trolls. I know that people are not really huge fans of this sort of thing, which is why I'm extremely concerned already about what the comments are going to be saying. But if you're the defenders, you need to be prepared for this. And time again, when we see this sort of thing happen, it's because they're not heavyweight enough up front. And they deserve everything they get as a result of that. Once again, the Trolls doing the business. Worrying times here, indeed, for the defenders thus far. I mean, this section of the Lindon force, they're going to have, I mean, they are now being used more aggressively. They're going to have to be. I think this ultimately has proven to be a bit of a mistake. But they can still salvage that. But unfortunately for them, I think, whether it's by accident or by design, I think Angmar have also reacted to this, or future-proofed it in a way that's also very, very effective, because they bottled them up with the Barrow-wights, even though now the elves are sort of trying to break out and maybe try and hit Angmar from the rear. They're not going to be able to get through the Barrow-wights that quickly, even with the Nolder in here. The Barrow-wights will lose in the long run, but they'll stay standing for a long time. By the time they do get out of here, it'll already be too late, I think. So, trapped in a pit of their own making here, I think. They still have plenty of units left in reserve, the defenders, of course, but this kind of momentum shift is always a little bit concerning when you see it happen. It's another 4v4 as well, so the defenders can't even point to the fact that they were horribly outnumbered right from the outset. Again, it's been poor, I've got to be honest. It's been very poor in terms of the initial organisation from the defenders. Spears of Azagal. Firing forward again, not learning their lesson, the Drake Brooding continuing to bully them.
Half the enemy force remains.
Half an attacking force remains. I imagine that has to be Angmar, one of the Angmar armies over on the other side, so it's not as if they're getting through this free of charge, and that may be the saving grace of the defenders in the end. The attackers are now being so aggressive that they're going to be taking losses fairly consistently across the board, but that's only really useful if you're able to set yourself up into a really solid, sure position to stand. I mean, Rhudaur over here appear to have really taken a beating since last we saw them, which is a little bit surprising given that the Blue Mountains didn't have that much over here. It must be from the marksman of Thorin's Halls, also Dunedain Rangers up here, also helping to do the business. Rhudaur's fragilities being exposed there, I suppose. Wardens Valos Tyrion. Guardians of Cardolan and Angmar Marauders pushing further into the settlement. They do need to be careful not to overextend themselves too much. I mean, Cardolan we haven't seen a huge amount of as of now, so they presumably still have a fair amount left in reserve. Barrow-White's cutting down the Elven General. Still trapped as they are over here, receiving still some support from the Frost Spears of Azaghal as well. Interesting to see how much damage they will have done come the end of the battle, because they're in a good position to offer their support, but like I said, firing against the Barrow-Whites means I don't necessarily know how many pure kills they will be getting. And my footman once again, Angmar trying to really leverage their overwhelming muscle, and again, like this is the sort of thing, like, the defenders really are deserving what they get here, because that is not an acceptable thing to be seeing. Witchram Hammerguard filtering around the side, and now they're going to be able to smash into the back of this front line, which doesn't really include too much that's important, but I mean, this is a good 300 men that are in there, which are probably going to end up routing with almost instant effect when they get a rear charge from the Witchram Hammerguard. Frost Spears are doing their best to do a lot of damage in response. I mean, Marksman of Thorin's Hall's also trying to rout the attackers now, but we shall see. It's a very chaotic fight, this. I mean, fair play to the attackers thus far. I think they've handled things in a way that is very befitting, certainly of Angmar, and they've maybe an overcomplication in the defensive shape. They've smashed it to bits initially. Snow Trolls doing their thing as well. Misty Mountain's able to link up directly now with Angmar, able to put on more of a united front, although I would argue that the Misty Mountains probably want to be, well, Rhudaur have also secured this area over here. Rhudaur of all the attackers probably have had the one engagement which has not gone too well for the attackers, and we didn't even really see what went down over here. Whatever happened very quickly. Guardians of the Blue Mountains now having to deal with Black Bolts and Enslavers on the front line, so bodyguard tier units it is. The unlocalized placement text are in here as well, however, so that is probably going to be enough to more than equal the quality that Rhudaur are trying to bring to bear against the Dwarves now. Troll Hunters moving forward as well. Difficult to gauge how effective those thrown projectiles are being. 9 Rangers also in close attendance. Guardians of Cardolan going to challenge the front line also. Steady as you go. Stuff like the crossbows in general are the sort of thing which as well may subtly start to influence the outcome of this battle as it goes along, because it's very difficult to keep track of what's actually going on there, unlike the Frost Spears where you can very clearly see what their projectiles are doing. I mean, this Lindon force is still looking like it could go on to be victorious over here, but Frost Spears continuing to pin the Angmarim as they move forwards. Lindar Bowmen now in position, so again starting to show their effectiveness. Greenway units routing off. Angmar pushing onwards, even though they haven't fully dealt with the units that are here. Still a unit of stone hewers that they want to be getting rid of. Any blows they can land with their axes upon the trolls will be appreciated, I'm sure. snow trolls. Heavy goblin crossbows on the way across to maybe try and assist Angmar once more. Give them that extra little boost they wanted, taking up positions that previously were held by the defending projectiles. Noldorin Blade Masters still in pretty good health as well. Be careful they don't get friendly fire, but Noldorin Blade Masters and Mythlon Sword Masters, all this shock infantry, exactly the sort of thing which will be better placed to deal with the Warlord's slightly healthier trolls of Angmar. Barrow-wights still here in high numbers, but maybe this is where things do start to turn around. As much as I was very harsh on the initial defence earlier on, the size of the settlement is now meaning that Angmar can't be quite so focused in their extreme aggression any longer. I think it would have probably been best for them had they turned around once they had completely conquered this front line over here to try and deal with this Lindon force, rather than trying to split their attention between pushing further forwards into the settlement and facing off against Lindon, especially with the quality that Lindon had left behind in that little area, because it means ultimately that they haven't been able to finish Lindon off, and nor have they made any further progress into the settlement, but maybe their allies can be a source of that. I mean, they have managed to overrun this part of the front line. The unlocalized placement text is still here. I wonder, well, the actual new variant of the test build is out now, and I'm sure that these guys will actually have their name at this point, along with the Dunlander artillery crew, which were the two which didn't have their names in. Some javelins over here as well. So Rhudaur are able to move forward, perhaps linking up with more of the Misty Mountains forces, and they'll be able to push further into the settlement. Wardens of Thorin's Halls are here. I mean, retreating further back into the settlement. This is pretty much the final stand over here. How the defenders choose to lay themselves out. Again, the complicated nature of this settlement means that, much like the last one, final stand areas can be a little bit more fluid than you might expect. There goes another route, so slowly but surely the defenders are fighting their way back into it. Marauders. Routing and broken. Not able to make this momentum stick, and now we're going to be acting on more of an even playing ground, I think. Drake Broodlings once again utilising their mass, and this mass pushing has been the attacker's greatest weapon. There goes a Dwarven General at the hands of plentiful armour piercing there. Lindon have now been finished off as a result of all that mass pushing, I think. Still, they did a job. I'm not sure whether it's going to be enough in the long run for them to see victory go their way, but we'll have to wait and see. Heavy Goblin crossbows also certainly playing a big part in that, along with the Drake Broodlings. Good support play from the Misty Mountains. Those crossbows, exactly the sort of thing which will punch through that fine Noldorin plate. Coldfell Maidens up here once again. Completely undefended Dunedain Rangers, and this is another thing which I would probably criticise the defenders for. Too often, skirmishers completely undefended, and Dunedain Rangers are the sort of skirmish you can't afford to leave undefended, because their damage is exactly the sort of thing you'll need going on further into the battle, going after Ethelwald's Troll Hunters and Ferocious Javelins. Coldfell Maidens just trying to interrupt them in melee. As soon as the Ferocious Javelins get there, that'll be unfortunate for them. Cardolan Archers, Sharpshooters still with a bit of ammunition as well. Still guarding this front line over here, though Tollkeeper's now moving once more. How will they set out their stall? I mean, it is mostly going to be Cardolan in the final stand. The Elves, most of them are gone. The Dwarves also suffering under that initial savagery. Cardolan maybe wouldn't have been the pick if the defenders had the luxury of choosing who they would want to be their final standers. Well, I mean, it depends how much stock you put in their crossbows, I suppose, but We shall see. Rhudaur rolling forward with all that shock infantry. The announcer seems to share my assessment that we're probably staring down the barrel of an attacker victory here as we march into the final 10,000 frames. More projectiles finding their mark. Rhudaur Cardolan Rangers as well. We've got their mercenary crossbows being used as a bludgeon, much like the Coalfell Maidens have been used in this battle actually. These units, very hard to gauge how useful they've been at range, but in melee both of them, especially the mercenary crossbows, are a little bit underwhelming when it comes to trying to do this job which Rhudaur is attempting to utilise them for. Cardolan still utilising their projectiles, and another unit of Dunedain Rangers. Marksman of Thorin's Hall still here, crossbows as well. A renewed assault perhaps from the front. Heavy Goblin crossbows going into the Tharbad Tollkeepers. An attack coming from this angle as well from Angmar. Once again they're trying to mass push through, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The Gundabad Guard, the only thing I'd criticise them for here is maybe they should have waited until they had a little bit more to help back this up, because even if they do make it through this front line, they don't really have anything to consolidate the gains with. But that was a fairly lightweight front line once again. Battered unit of Cardolan Sharpshooters and Wardens of Alos Tyrion. Not going to be enough to deal with a mass push from a fully healthy unit of Gundabad Guard, although that health is rapidly deteriorating now. Cardolan Archers peeling off. Going to have to be used as makeshift infantry. Their armour values are enough that they can do a job there as long as they have ample ranged and melee support to make that work. Pushing through this hall of doors. Defeat almost a certainty for Angmar as they're pushing through here as well. Maybe getting a little bit too clever with it and not consolidating down a single choke, which probably would have been the best call here. Angmar, you've seen in this battle, they're truly at their best when they have their whole army really working towards one singular purpose. Snow Trolls though just barging through the front line once again. They were also pretty effective at doing that against the Blue Mountains force in the initial parts of the battlefield. Lindon Mariners and Ruffians, neither of which are going to be that good at dealing with trolls. Some of the trolls are getting left behind however, but again, Tharbad Tollkeepers on the front line. Cardolan Sharpshooters, the Maces will be a little bit more useful, but the Snow Trolls are not quite as armour dependent as their brethren from Angmar, I guess you'd call them. Oh God, still doing their thing. I mean, we are seeing the battle contract now around the Hall of Doors. Now moving forward, Wards of Thorin's Halls depleted, Hearthguard of Ammon's Soul less so, and the Rhudaur Axemen don't have the quality really to deal with the Hearthguard straight up. Essenmore's Troll Hunters. And Black Oryx the Mountains. It's also worrying as well when you see still healthy Hranonine pikemen moving forward. It means that if it does come down to pure melee, the attackers do have that phalanx option. And White Turret Fearmongers as well. We mentioned them in the deployment phase as being a very useful asset. I mean, it feels kind of like they're still trying to retreat back here, the defenders, but honestly they've left that too late if you're asking me. Perhaps one of the more minor sins we've seen, considering that if they tried to retreat they would take probably too many losses for it to be worthwhile, but still another one to add to the list. Victory seems certain, only a fool could lose this battle. The battle perhaps, but the war is looking like it's ebbing away. In terms of percentages, I mean, it's very close, honestly. Only 2% of the defenders more have been killed, but it's a matter of momentum here. The attackers, with their extreme aggression, we're always going to be taking a lot of damage in the doing, but it's also exactly the modus operandi, especially of Angmar, but also when you consider what the Misty Mountains are all about with their numbers, they can also engage in such things. Especially when you consider that some of Tommy's units were not on that front line that they initially bulldozed their way through as well, so that numbers discrepancy became even greater. Rhudaur may have lost one of their initial battles, but they themselves are not exactly a small army either, and the damage they can do as a supporting foil to the other two, dangerous. Much of this, though, in my opinion, has been the problem of the defender's own making. Not completely out of it yet, but cross spears now get involved in melee. Gatekeepers, Dunedain Rangers still have ammunition, but how much ammunition the defenders have left is going to be the deciding factor here, I think, as to whether or not they can get back into this game. Firing into the Trollshore Axe, those javelins, Lindon Mariners there into the backs of the units that are trying to attack through here, and they are holding the Misty Mountains force here back, largely as a result of that support, and ever more so actually the numbers are favouring the defenders in this microcosm of an engagement. But Angmar forcing their way through over here, ruffians, snow trolls finally being laid low, but they've certainly done their job in this battle. Trolls of Angmar as well. Once again, showcasing their effectiveness, even though stats-wise, Trolls of the White Hand and Olag High, and I've seen with my own eyes actually in a game that I've played, the Olag High be brutally effective, but in the replays that I've shown, it's been the Trolls of Angmar who have probably been the pick of the bunch, ironically enough. Tron Blackguards still in fairly decent spirits themselves as well, 27 of them, unsurprisingly. Tharbad Tollkeepers rout in the face of them. There were Tharbad Warhammers over here, which is probably why the initial assault was halted in its tracks, but as soon as equivalent quality arrived, and Trolls hitting them from the back as well, the Cardolan front line ultimately did fold. Here are the Crawlers, much lighter colour scheme than the rest of the units around them, in and amongst all the jet black of Angmar. Marksman Thorin's Halls. They just routed. Pikes, Barrow-wights as well, still very much alive. I think the fact that the Barrow-wights are still alive with over 100 of them left alive is a sign that ultimately that didn't work. I don't know whether it was by accident or design, like I said, if the Barrow-wights were simply designed to bottle that Elven force up while they focused on other things. If it was by design, the attackers deserve a lot of credit for that, because that was a very, very good move. Even if it wasn't, it's a sign of it not being the best idea in the first place, in my opinion, but there we have it. It made the battle a little bit more interesting, I think, as a result of that slightly odd shape, but it also gave the attackers everything they needed. Continuing to move forward. Yeah, the gap is now widening in favour of the attackers. It's just going to be a case of finishing the final standoff here, I think, in these latter stages. In the shadow of the dwarven statues, crossbeards of Azagal. Again, we have seen them used well. I think in conjunction with maybe the higher punch of the Cardolan crossbows, we could have seen them be even more effective, but it ultimately wasn't to be on this occasion. Blackguard. Also still very much alive. I do like how the Frost Spears have got this sort of dual weapon really. They're repeater, but it also has an axe blade on the end. Kind of similar to how the Uruk-hai crossbows now use their crossbows as a melee weapon as a result of a almost machete-esque bayonet that they've got on it now, which again is kind of in keeping for what the Urukai would make. Dunedain Rangers trying to enhance their own kill count a little bit. The Gatekeepers fighting hard on the front line. And armour piercing maybe enough to bring the trolls down before the battle is over, but not too much beyond that, you would suggest. The drummers. There goes the Misty Mountains General. Almost like it tripped over there because there was no attack animation from the Frostbeard, so it must have been a shot in the back from the Dunedain Rangers. Troll drummers are one of those things that you can't really... You would notice them if they weren't there, I think. But now they are. It's a big tool for the Misty Mountains to use to try and offset the mental fragility that they do have as a faction overall. Merc crossbows. Still ammunition on the attacking crossbows as well. And they were one of the main causes of that little Lindon strong point also being broken. I was a little bit sceptical over whether the attackers would have the ability to use their supporting units as effectively in a settlement that offers a little bit more cover, unlike the last one, but they've used them well, partially as a result of, again, the positions the defenders decided to try and take up, but you beat what's in front of you. Warrior Spear Guard. Gatekeepers forcing their way uphill. Warrior Spear Guard.
Our men have fought
Sort of
long,
unit that
becoming tired.
you would have expected to die long ago in this fight, but there's time enough yet for that. Even with the troll drummers in close proximity, they're still thinking of routing. Although the drummers are being used as a melee unit now, and they don't have quite the same effect on a front line as the snow trolls or the trolls of Angmar that we've seen in this battle thus far. Rhudaur pikemen being used as well. I mean, it is, to be fair, the percentage is contracting once again, probably as a result of the damage the Dunedain Rangers have been able to do. It won't matter too much in the long run. It is going to be, percentage-wise, very, very close. One of those weird cases where you kind of always know what the outcome is going to be. Rhudaur Berserk is still in good health as well. Obviously that's a bodyguard tier unit. Well, actually no, not anymore, is it? It's one of those units that was a bodyguard tier unit and now been sort of demoted to being a very high tier but more numerous one, which I think probably suits them better actually, because it means their initial volleys from their throwing projectile will be a little bit more effective. And as a bodyguard unit they really didn't offer too much that the enslavers didn't already, so it didn't really make sense to have the two of them as exactly the same sort of thing. Onwards to finally silence the Dunedain Rangers. Spears. Victory seems certain for the Frost Spears of Azaghal for now. I mean, solid enough combatants in melee. I think the thing that does convince me that this doesn't really matter in the long run is the fact that Frontline pikemen are here, although they are pointing the wrong way. So you never know. Barrow White's still very much alive. We didn't really see the Witches. I do wonder if the Witches got any sort of hit off. Cardolan's general falls. Yes, and if anyone is going to lose heart and flee at the loss of a general among the defenders, it would be Cardolan. The shelter that the Blue Mountains offered cracked open with instant effect. Witch King will be pleased. A shower of throwing axes there, the mercenary crossbows demolished. Cardolan gone. So the Blue Mountains will be the last ones left fighting on home turf here. Victory seems certain for them. stock really of what is remaining. Cardolan Berserker is really the only thing I think that's of notably high quality. Try and pike one up there. Barrow Whites, depending on how you look at them. Stragglers from the Misty Mountains going forward. There may be the odd Witch Realm Blackguard in here as well, but not a huge amount left of really high quality. And 5% as a difference, I think, probably does make sense. The Crawler's still alive as well. The Crawlers, I think, thematically add a lot to the Misty Mountains at the low tier as well. The Frost Spears, give them their credit. They're not going down without a fight. Unsteady as an egg on a stick. As soon as I say that, of course, that's when the final rout does happen. This unit of Frost Spears has probably lasted so long because they've been primarily facing the low damage Barrow Whites, and they've had their back pinned against the cliff. The odd hit or two coming in from the Crownline Rangers as well, trying to hasten their demise. Berserkers pushing their way to the front will finish this off. I mean, they are going to rout ultimately. It won't be a case of them all dying to the last man, I think, considering the fact we have less than 200 frames remaining and the dwarves don't have a tendency to die that quickly. And there we go.
We have nothing to be ashamed of. It was but a cruel twist of fate that snatched victory.
Well, there we go. And the attackers were the victors on that occasion. It's one of those interesting ones though where I do think the defenders played into their hands in certain ways, like we mentioned. I think that initial shape from the elves and the dwarves out on that outer point, it was a more interesting thing to do than the alternative, but it was also it didn't work. Let's be frank here, it didn't work. And the mass pushing of the attackers, I'm sure that people will make their feelings known about that in the comments below on this one, because it's not the most popular tactic when we see it employed, but the reason we do is because it's brutally effective. And if they had stayed in that position doing things in a more straight up fashion, they would have been shot to death very, very quickly, I think, with the crossfire that the defenders had laid on. So asking the attackers not to do that in this situation, particularly Angmar, who are very, very good at that sort of warfare, is akin to fighting with one arm tied behind your back. So I think the attackers, it's a very valid way of playing the game, and if you're not prepared for it as the defenders, you deserve what comes your way, like I mentioned earlier on. And the Misty Mountains also, the Drake Broodlings also engaged in that sort of thing, and Tommy's Dwarven force down in that lower section of the fortress was also not prepared for that, and ultimately they ended up getting bowled over as well. And that set the tone, really. The momentum did slow as the battle went on because of the size of the settlement, of course, and the fact that Angmar were having to go down multiple routes, and it ended up not working out quite as well, but the gains they had made early on ultimately were enough to carry them through right to the end of the battle, I think. Rhudaur as well ended up doing a lot of damage fairly quickly once they ended up getting going, but again, you can see from the kill counts really from the defenders that they were able to do a lot of damage to the attackers as they did this, but on the eye test of the battle, and I'm sure everyone would agree, there was never really a moment in that fight where I felt confident the defenders were going to be able to turn it around in spite of the damage they were clearly doing. And Cardolan, obviously the last ones left standing with a fairly sizable army at the end, and crossbows and rangers and the like were undoubtedly the main source of damage for Medexa. But ultimately too many of the dwarves and elves had already perished at that point, and Cardolan were being asked to try and dig their entire team out by the end, and that's always going to be a difficult thing to manage. Let's see what did the damage for the Blue Mountains army zone. The Frostspear is getting 704 kills, so that's far more than I would have expected them to get, and that is the main unit that did end up getting the kills. It is a sign really of how damaging the Frostspears can be if you give them a target they can hit consistently and with a clear line of sight, and in this kind of settlement that is very doable. And it is perhaps more of a sign really that if the defenders had set out their stall early on in a more organised fashion that was more conducive for utilising their skirmishers to their utmost potential, You can see here one of the units of Frost Spears only just breaking 100, so the difference between the two, if you had had 2 of those units getting the same, that would have been enough, and that's only 1 unit. So again, it's one of those. I think the infantry units, some of them doing fine, I think, considering the opposition they're up against. Some of them underperforming. Wardens of Thorin's Halls doing okay. Marksmen of Thorin's Halls, again, more ranged units doing the business. Guardians of the Blue Mountains, the same. Unlocalized placement techs doing pretty well in melee against Rhudaur. Frostspears of Azgal, once again, 554, 265 is a sign of how very effective they can be, and it's a sign really of how much of an asset Ered Luin can be when they're on the defence, because that extra ranged focus in comparison to Khazad-dûm and Erebor gives them that edge. They may not have quite the same heft in melee as Erebor or certainly Khazad-dûm, but they have enough, and being dwarves, and with that extra ranged focus, it makes them a fairly potent mix. But unfortunately, on this occasion, they weren't able to levy that for long enough as a result of the high aggression that the attackers showcased. So yeah, I'll be interested to hear what people thought of that, because I think the attackers were deserving victors. They played to the strengths of their relative factions, and I think as a result of the way the defenders set their stall out early on, it played into their hands a little bit. I think, again, it's going to be one of those where people aren't too enamoured with the tactics that especially Angmar often use, but it is what it is. If you're the defenders, you need to be prepared to deal with that sort of thing, especially when more than one Angmar army is on the field, of course. But yes, big thank you to Dabo for sending this one in. I was glad that I was able to get it to work in the end, and yeah, big thank you for all the players as well for being a part of this battle replay. The next one, as I mentioned, is going to be one from Adin Men, I believe, and it's going to be another Dwarven battle, though I think that is going to be a Dwarf civil war between Ered Luin and Erebor. Unless I'm very much mistaken, I think I can get that one to work as well. I'm glad that I've managed to get these two to work. Moving forward, we will of course be going on to the slightly updated version of the test build as well. So yes, more to come on that at a later date, however, but that's the next one that I'm going to be recording anyway. So yeah, big thank you to Dabo for sending this one in and for making another map. Long may that continue. Big thanks to all the players for being a part of this battle replay. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.